Hi there, and thanks once again for tuning in to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to talk about Franco German cooperation by 1931 to establish peace and security in Europe, and also to establish trading relations, customs unions, and further economic integration between the two powers. It's the sort of thing that can be seized on now in this current turmoil within the EU and Brexit and all that sort of thing as evidence of some sort of long-term plan for European integration. Whether Gustav Stresemann and Aristide Briand, the two diplomats that we're going to be looking at today, saw it quite in those terms in 1931 is unlikely. The fact of the matter, however, is that even at the Paris Peace Conference, it was noted that Germany and France would eventually have to trade together with one another, particularly in the quantities of coal and iron ore, in order for trade and industry to become restored in the ravaged parts of Europe, particularly northern and eastern France that had been occupied by the Germans, and Germany itself that had been economically crippled by the war. Talk of customs unions in Europe go back to the 18th century. Napoleon was very keen on creating an internal European market that was protected from British penetration from British imperial goods such as Indian cotton, and the idea of creating a single marketplace with uniform standards, weights and measures, and that sort of thing was a French revolutionary idea. The idea that local eccentricities, economic, cultural, and social, could be swept away in the march of revolutionary reason was something that Napoleon was able to march across Europe, and an element of this for forever remained. However, when we look at the context of the 1930s, it's not Napoleon that casts kind of the long shadow, but the First World War and the efforts in order to rehabilitate Europe, in order to stabilise and settle Europe, that happened at the Paris Peace Conference, which were of limited success. The fact of the matter is that the initiatives that take place in the 1930s to try to stabilise liberal democracies and make them viable in Europe have an uphill struggle, because what the First World War has unleashed and what the Paris Peace Conference struggled to contain was an explosion of new nationalisms, and particularly violent racial ethnic nationalisms. We're not just talking about the spectre of Nazism in Germany here, but the rise of racial nationalisms all across Eastern and Central Europe due to the collapse of the Russian, Ottoman, and Austro-Hungarian empires. The evidence suggests, from looking at the archives of the French and German foreign officers, that there was a mutual effort over a long period of time to diffuse post-war tensions, particularly after 1923 and the Ruhr crisis, and to try to enter into discussions about European economic integration. Both the German Foreign Office and the French Foreign Ministry at the Quai d'Orsay were very powerful institutions, sometimes working at arm's length from chancellors and prime ministers, and able to pioneer policies which they believed were beneficial for their respective nations. But both Aristide Briand and Gustav Stresemann of France and Germany respectively had met each other at the Locarno treaties in 1926 and had become admirers of one another, if not friends. The third fiddle in that conversation was Austin Chamberlain, the brother of, or half-brother of, Neville Chamberlain, who represented Great Britain. Both Stresemann and Briand were, throughout the 1920s, making efforts to bring about rapprochement between the powers and also economic integration, if not possibly political integration. And the motivation on both parts was the understanding that the United States was now the sole global economic hegemon. Even as a result, even following the Great Depression, America was still economically far more powerful, or had far more potential power than any other country in the world. That European empires were, if not in retreat, certainly at a crossroads, and one further war would end them completely. And the 19th century, the age of European great power, was over. Instead of empires, there were nation states, and these nation states would need to find in Europe a way of getting on, cooperating, collaborating in ways that had not been possible previously. The reason why it happens in the 1930s is simple: the legacy of the Great War. The First World War was an unprecedented apocalypse in European history with no previous parallel, and even the Napoleonic Wars don't come close to the levels of destruction wrought. And this meant that new ways of configuring politics and new ways of conceiving of Europe after the First World War needed to be sought, because a repetition of the First World War was simply unthinkable. The tragedy that a second war was at this point but 8 years away was unknown to both men. The idea that Germany might fall to a dictatorship within 2 years, again, was unknown to both men. And this period of time is complicated and often misunderstood, because when one thinks about Germany in the 1930s, one's thoughts instinctively go towards Nazism, hardly a political force for rapprochement and conciliation in any conceivable way. So the idea that there was Franco-German dialogue happening up to 2 years before the accession of Hitler to the Reich Chancellery really goes rather neglected. French and German diplomats had quite a long history of working towards rapprochement. Joseph Caillaux, the French Prime Minister before the First World War, thought that Germany was the greatest threat to France, and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 had proven that. But in order to deal with German militarism, he adopted the policy of trying to improve economic relations and economic collaboration based on the age-old assumption, which does have some validity to it, that countries that trade together are far less likely to fight one another. In January 1919, as the Paris Peace Conference was beginning, a French delegation secretly visited Berlin to sound out the possibility of some kind of Franco-German economic partnership, which would reorganize and redevelop the European economy in general. Now, obviously, this wasn't successful, but there were other approaches in 1921 and 1922. In 1921, the Wiesbaden Agreement was signed between France and Germany, which agreed that the system of reparations would eventually be replaced by German direct investment in the war zones of northern France. The British vetoed this, derailing it, but the potential that the Wiesbaden Agreement had was immense, as it offered the French investment to rebuild their shattered economy and infrastructure, and eventually Germany would have been able to see some return on investment as well, giving Germany a natural incentive to keep the peace with France. There was an attempt in 1922 to revive it by the German industrialist Hugo Steins, but again, this was vetoed. Raymond Poincaré, who came to office in January that year, was not inclined to be conciliatory towards Germany, and thought it was more electorally appealing to have a confrontational and domineering approach with a weakened Germany, and we see that the following year during the Ruhr crisis. The Germans at this point have suspended the payment of reparations in cash because of the hyperinflation crisis that has been mounting. And in January 1923, France marches its expeditionary force into the Ruhr along with Belgium, and the possibilities of Franco-German cooperation seem to stall fundamentally at that point. The consequences of this new robust approach are devastating. The destruction of Germany's middle class through hyperinflation and the wiping out of savings, which was in part the direct result of the Ruhr crisis, but also in part of a creeping inflation that had been on the march since the start of the war. This deprived German savers of their financial security and pushed an entire generation of potentially moderate centre ground voters towards the right in sheer desperation. But obviously, the real fruits of this would be captured by the extreme right and the Nazis after 1929. The solution that the French sought now was to bring about the fragmentation of Germany, to perhaps be able to annex parts of the industrial and coal regions of the Ruhr, to encourage more disparate areas such as Bavaria to break away, and to deal with the ongoing question of French security by returning Germany to the state that it was at prior to unification, a sort of a rough version of the Holy Roman Empire. The failure to comprehensively assert French national power over Germany and the passive resistance that the French encounter in the Ruhr was electoral suicide for Poincaré, who found himself voted out of office, and it left the British and the Americans with the problem of trying to negotiate some sort of mediated agreement to end the reparations crisis. The flow of reparations from Germany to the British and the French, who were then obliged to repay their debts to the United States, was a fundamental obstacle to the creation of a permanent, secure European system. However, one of the results of the fall of Poincaré due to the reparations crisis and the Ruhr crisis was that once again foreign ministers in France and Germany both realised that any attempts to bring about the destruction of the other were mutually backfiring, and that, like it or not, cooperation seemed to be the only meaningful alternative. There were a number of issues where it was unlikely there was going to be any kind of conciliation or collaboration, but on the issue of the economy of the two countries' mutual economies, then that was entirely possible. There had been a number of Franco-German business cartels emerging. Obviously, there were the business cartels emerging in post-war Germany, such as IG Farben, but Franco-German business collaboration was something relatively new. Franco-German diplomats and politicians also had an eye on the emergence of the Soviet Union as a new and assertive and alarming power post-revolution and the chaos period of the Civil War. After 1928, of course, Stalin emerges as the dictator of the Soviet Union, and the initiation of the 5-year plans, the collectivization of agriculture, and the forced industrialization and development of the Soviet Union does not go unnoticed in Europe. On the other side of the Atlantic, the United States, as a hegemon is also an existential threat. The reason for this, of course, is the Second World War hasn't happened yet. The post-war world where the United States creates NATO in partnership with Western European countries, again, that hasn't happened yet. And instead, the world that exists is a world of European imperialism, which is still a significant and viable force that has these two largely anti-imperialist, though history proves us wrong on both counts, these notionally anti-imperialist forces of the United States and the Soviet Union that act as a kind of an almost vice for Europe and its power. Europe that has been fatally weakened by the First World War, crippled with debt, and a continent which now has lost the sheen of civilization. The notion that existed throughout 19th century Europe that the epicenter of civilization existed in the European continent was destroyed by the First World War. In 1929, Aristide Briand proposed the creation of a European Union. It was an idea that had been entertained by Gustav Stresemann, who had come up with roughly comparable ideas, but who obviously died in October of that year. The idea was that Franco German peace could be guaranteed through European integration, and this would not necessarily pull parliamentary sovereignty, but it would pull aspects of national sovereignty in the interests of cooperation, as really all treaties do. The reality of the situation is that despite how much nationalist figures demand some kind of perfect utopian sovereignty, any agreement between two nations will inevitably mean that there are compromises on sovereignty, that certain aspects of administration or security or trade or what have you are exchanged, and that in this kind of complicated economic integration that was being suggested, there would be an agreement to harmonize economies and so that they were more closely integrated. And obviously the final expression of this in the 21st century would be the creation of the euro. Both Briand and Stresemann looked to the growing threats of Soviet communism and fascism in Europe and thought that an alliance of democratic Christian nations would be able to economically collaborate in order to lift the continent out of the depression that racked it after 1929 and to create a bulwark against these forces. The tragedy, of course, is that this was not to be. The 4 years from 1929 to 1933 see a collapse of German democracy, the rise of Nazism, and other authoritarian regimes across the continent, and the Second World War result in the triumph and then destruction of Nazism, and the triumph and failure of Soviet communism, ending in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is interesting to note that Great Britain was a very reluctant figure on the periphery of these conversations throughout the 1920s and 30s, and was fearful and suspicious of Franco-German rapprochement and the idea of a developing Franco-German powerhouse, and Britain appears to have reprised this role despite its best efforts and the best efforts of politicians from Ted Heath in 1973 onwards to now inhabit the position of continental outsider. But obviously Britain will be embarking on this journey in very different circumstances than the beneficial ones that existed for Great Britain after 1919. The success of European integration after the Second World War also is reliant on very different conditions. The involvement of the United States and United States dollars pouring into Europe in the guise of Marshall aid made it much more likely that European integration would succeed, particularly as Marshall aid had conditions attached, and that meant that there would have to be the development of some kind of economic and or political system, political integration in Western Europe in order to prevent there from being resurgent fascism or communism. So the plans of Stresemann and Briand in the 1920s that were derailed by 1932 by economic and political crisis. And it was the shadow of a Second World War that made the ideas of Briand and Stresemann not just utopian but absolutely essential. And so it's an interesting story in a way about how economic and social and political and military realities shape the politics and turn fanciful notions into the plain, the everyday, and the common sense. So it would appear after World War II there's nothing quite like the threat of the Red Army in East Germany and Eastern Europe to help focus the thoughts. Anyway, I've gone on for way too long, so I'm going to finish this podcast here, and we'll be continuing later today with some more observations on the developing crisis for Great Britain in 1940 as we move towards the Blitz. Thanks very much for listening. All the best. Bye-bye.